Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be showing you how I set up my bullet journal for November, and this one setup is going to have a couple of extra steps, so let's get started. This month's theme is a plaid flannel theme, which I think is perfect for November because when it's this time of year and it's getting chillier, I basically only ever want to be wearing flannel. So before we do anything in our actual journal, I pulled out a couple of pieces of watercolor paper and I'm going to be watercoloring a plaid pattern onto this paper. I'm using an Inktense palette here. This is very similar to watercolor, but one of the characteristics that makes it different is that once your ink is dry, since it's not technically a paint, it will stay put and it won't bleed again or get reactivated by water. So I really love this palette because it's great for layering colors so that all of the stripes in our plaid will stay very distinct instead of bleeding. But if you don't have this, then you can just use watercolors and just try to work quickly so that none of that color gets reactivated when you're layering. I'm starting off by just painting on a diagonal strip here, and I'm going to be doing a very autumn palette. So for this first one, I'm going to be painting with browns and oranges, and I'm just making sure I really water down my pigment here. This will depend on what kind of paint you're using and how pigmented it is. Since this pan is called an Inktense pan, I'm sure you can imagine that the color is very intense for this one, so I just wanted to make sure I added lots of water in my palette before I put any color onto my paper. So I'm just doing a series of parallel lines here in this first color, and then I pulled out a thicker brush that I'm going to be using for the rest of this because the brush I was using worked okay, but I just think that this flat shape works a lot better because you can get really wide stripes by using it flat on the paper, but you can also turn it the other way to make very thin stripes, and this was a lot quicker for me to use. As I go, I'm just adding in different colors that I want to introduce into my color palette and kind of blending my colors together in my pan so that everything just is very cohesive. If you want to make your stripes more distinct, you can do all of them in one direction. Let them completely dry before you do them in the other direction. You can see that I didn't really have the patience to wait for that, so some of my colors do bleed a little bit, but again, since I'm using these Inktense paints, they do stay pretty distinct, and I really like the way that they layer and have that overlap area in between the stripes. This is going to be a pretty simple pattern, and it's pretty much just playing around with different colors, which I love to do, and just play around with the different widths. Make sure you have a few widths in each color and section, and you're bound to come out with something that looks great. And the reason I'm doing this on separate pieces of paper and not directly into my journal is so that my paper won't warp. Most journals don't have paper that's thick enough to handle this amount of water. But another reason I'm doing this is so that I can cut these pieces of paper into different shapes and sizes later on and pick my favorite sections of each of these patterns. Now I'm just starting on a different color palette. Again, I want to do a plaid flannel type of look, but I did want to have a different color option as well. So this time I'm doing a blue and kind of orangey red palette. I really like to use blue with oranges because they're complementary colors, so they always look really nice together, and I think it's nice to just stick to some of those warmer tones in the reds and oranges as well to tie into this fall season and also to match with the other plaid piece I did earlier. So I'm just going to continue painting on here. In this one, I tried to cover a lot more of the area so that there isn't as much white showing. Not necessarily using more pigment, but just filling in a lot of spaces with more diluted color, and I really like how this turned out because it looks like a more full and robust pattern without being overly vibrant, if that makes sense. But again, you can just play with this and you can go ahead and do another pattern if you're just having fun with it and want to have more options. I just did two and I had enough to use for all my spreads. By the way, these are pretty large pieces of paper as well. I believe they're about 6 by 11. I just wanted to make sure that I had enough to cut from, especially because when you're doing something like this, the edges of the pieces won't necessarily look perfect, so I usually like to trim those off anyway and use more of the middle section. After I finished with these two pieces and just set them aside to dry for a bit, I pulled out the journal that I'm using, which is a different one this time because I completely filled up my last journal for 2019, which I'm very happy and excited about because that means I get to do a flip through soon for the end of the year. But since there's only a couple of months left in the year, I bought a pack of slightly thinner notebooks. You can see these are just paperback notebooks and a lot thinner than the one I was using before, and I'll leave a link below if you want to see which ones I'm using. I just got them off of Amazon and it was a really great deal, and I love the size of this. And I'll update you guys on how I like this journal later on as I've used it a little more. Since I'm using a brand new journal and I have this perfect cover that is waiting to be decorated, I figured I would do something a little more involved for this cover page this month. And I'm going to be doing a shaker window. So I just traced an oval shape on the first page, and I actually pulled out 2 pages and layered them, and underneath I just stuck some junk mails just so that I wouldn't cut through more pages. And I'm using my X-Acto knife to carefully cut out that oval shape that I traced. So I'm cutting through 2 layers of paper right here, just making sure I add enough pressure so that it goes through both sheets at once. And obviously be careful because you're using a very sharp knife at this point. You could also just cut with your scissors from the middle and then cut around the edge, but I just think it looks a little cleaner if I do it this way. Then I pulled out 2 pieces of acetate, which is basically just like a clear plastic sheet. If you don't have this, you can also just save some plastic packaging from something and just repurpose it for this. But again, I'll leave a link down below for the material that I'm using. And then before I glue anything in, I'm going to be adding my header here just because once I tape stuff in, it might be a little uneven and hard to letter on top of. So I just did a really quick script title for November. And to make things look a little more refined, I also added a dash line all around the edge of that oval shape, just to call out that shape a little better as well. So now I have these 2 layers of cut out shapes and then 2 sheets of acetate in between. And then on the sheet behind that, I'm going to have one of my plaid patterns beneath. So I'm just trying to figure out which one I want to have and what my favorite section of each of these patterns is as well, because I can just cut around whatever part of the pattern that I like the best. So I just went ahead and trimmed that out for now, and then I'm going to get started on taping my acetate sheets in place. So I'm taking some very skinny double-sided tape here, and I'm just placing it along the outside edge of my cut out oval shape, trying to place the tape as close together as possible so that there are no gaps. I'm going to be filling in this little shaker area with sequins, and I don't want any of those to fall out, so I just want to make sure that I completely enclose this space with tape. And I really like using this super skinny double-sided tape as well because it's really easy to just curve and manipulate into the correct shape. So now that I have both of these sides of acetate taped to the backs of these pages, I'm going to fill it in with some sequins and just little embellishments that I have. I have these sequin leaves and also these tiny little sequin flowers and stars, and I thought that that would be perfect for fall. So I just threw those in and kept them enclosed in the cutout area. And then again, I'm going to be outlining the shape with double-sided tape, and then very carefully closing in this shaker window on itself to completely seal it together. I also made sure to add some extra thicker double-sided tape all along the edges of the paper just to make sure that everything will be completely sealed and flat so that it just looks like it's one piece. When it's finished, I love the end effect of this. I think it's so fun and different, and it's something I used to love to do for cards as well. So if you want to experiment with this and just play around, then you can go ahead and make a little greeting card for someone with this same technique. Then on the next page, I'm going to glue down my cutout plaid panel so that you can see it through the window. I think it's really fun that you are able to see this pattern through the window, but then once you turn it, you can also just decorate this page a little more as well. So I'm adding some washi tape just to fill in some of the extra space around this panel. I picked out a few rolls that I'm going to be using throughout all of my spreads. Just in a couple of more muted patterns that I think will go well with a lot of different designs. And I'll be doing a lot of layering this month as well, so I thought it would be nice to just bring in a couple more elements to be able to do that. Then on the back side of the window, I did another dashed line just to tie it all together and again, just make it look a little more complete. And that finishes off the cover. I hope it's not too complicated to follow. I know if it's your first time doing it, it might be a little difficult to remember all the steps, but just make sure you rewind and rewatch it if you need to, because I think the effect is really cool and it's going to be something really fun to have in the beginning of this journal or of your month. So now moving on to my monthly calendar, I'm again taking out my Inktense palette and I'm going to be watercoloring a quick little header for November. I know I said I don't usually like to watercolor on my journals, and while that's true, I think if you're just doing a very small area like this and just making sure you don't use too much water, it should be fine. If there is buckling on your pages, then it should be very minimal, and as long as you're not doing a full page background, I think it'll be okay. Then I drew in a shape for this calendar and just outlined the whole thing and shaded in a header at the top too for the days of the week. Then I added a drop shadow with my black pen. With the shape of this month's dates, I have all of this extra space at the top, so I cut off another strip of one of my watercolor pieces and I split it into two so that I could have one piece on each side of the page, and I'm just taping that into place just to bring in some more of that pattern. And I'm going to be layering washi tape on that as well. So again, even though it takes a little bit of extra time to do those pieces in the beginning, it's really great because then it makes it very quick for you to put together all of these layouts later on, because all you have to do is cut pieces from the watercolor you already did and just tape them in place with some washi, and then you end up with a very beautiful layout. So I'm just filling in the rest of my calendar right now with the dates. And I also decided to add lines to all of my boxes, even though I wasn't planning on doing that originally. But I think it works because it kind of goes along with this very geometric plaid flannel look that we have this month. Now I'm going to get started on the first weekly layout for the month. I'm going to be doing a very collage styled layout, so I pulled out some elements that I thought would look nice. So I have all of these scraps of my watercolor pieces that I have from cutting out from the earlier spreads, and then I also have a page of an old book and some letter stickers as well. And of course the washi tape that I had showed you previously. So these are the main things that I'm going to be using for layering, and I'm just going to start playing around and put down different elements onto this paper and just rearranging them until I like the way they look. I like to rip some of the pieces so that has a more rustic look to it. And what's great about this is that if you mess up and you don't like where you put your washi tape, you always can move it because it's so easy to remove. And it also keeps things temporarily in place as well. So super useful and also very cute. Your layout doesn't have to look exactly like mine. Just play around because you're going to have different pieces and different washi tapes. So just play around with it until it's something that you're happy with. One tip that I have is to try and lay things out in different areas on each page, so don't keep everything on one side, and this just makes it a little more visually interesting. Once I have all of my paper and tape pieces adhered down, I'm going to go ahead and put in my letter stickers for this. I really like how these letter stickers add a little bit more color. You've probably seen me using these stickers before, but I'm just trying to use up my stash, so use what you have. If you don't have letter stickers, then you can just go ahead and letter in these numbers, of course, or even watercolor them on as well. For my next weekly layout, I'm going to try and recreate the watercolor pieces I did in the beginning, but this time I wanted to show you a different option using markers instead, just in case you don't have watercolor or just don't really want to go for that option. I'm using Crayola Super Tip markers here, and I like these ones specifically because they don't bleed, so even if you put a lot of color and ink onto your page, it's fine even if you have a thin papered journal. So I am just doing the same thing I did before and adding in some diagonal lines and then adding another set at a perpendicular. And what really helps when doing this is having a T-ruler. This is particularly helpful for this rather than when we were doing the watercolor one, because when you're working with a notebook that folds in the middle, sometimes it just gets kind of difficult to continue your straight lines from one edge to the other. So I really like using this ruler, and it helps me to keep things pretty straight. I actually don't color like straight up against the edge, but it just gives you a good guide because I do kind of like to have a little bit of irregularity in my strokes so that everything is not so perfect. I think it just gives it more of a handmade and rustic feel. So I have a color palette of pinks, reds, and browns and warm oranges here. What I'm doing is trying to keep the lightest colors towards the center of the page, and you can see how I have like a darker brown and a darker maroon color, and I try to keep those just to the edges because we're going to have to put stuff over this later on, and I want to make sure that we're going to be able to have things be legible, so I just try to keep the lightest colors towards the center. Okay, so just about wrapping up my pattern here. You can see how it's much more vibrant than the watercolor ones I did before, just because you're not able to dilute the color with water, so it's a bit of a bolder look, but it's just something different that you can play around with. And if you like more color like this, you can just do this instead for your beginning pieces instead of watercolor. And now to finish off the page and actually be able to write things on top of this crazy pattern, I pulled out some vellum, which is a translucent piece of paper. It's very similar to tracing paper, but it's a little smoother, and I'll link the one that I'm using in the description box. If you don't have this, you can try tracing paper if you have that instead, or you can just completely do something different and collage on a different type of paper like graph paper or just white writing paper as well. And since this material is translucent, if I added tape to it, then it would show through to the other side, and I don't want that. So I just very simply attached all of these with a strip of washi at the top, and it creates a little hinge as well, so that's something fun to play with. So very simple and easy to attach these, and then I'm going to finish them off by just adding some dates to the tops of these, and then also adding in a hand-drawn border, just so that it gives these a little bit more structure, because I know they are a little bit hard to see since they're translucent on top of this very bold pattern. And it's easy to write on them with the pens I'm using, by the way. They don't bleed or anything like that, so I think it's just fun to play with different materials in your journal like this. If these layouts are a little too crazy and complicated for you, then this next one might be perfect for you. I'm just sticking to a very simple tried and true layout here. I have two strips of my watercolor pattern, and I'm just taping these to either side of my spread just to act as these nice little borders. And then I'm going to create some color block headers with my super tip markers. I accidentally made all 8 of them the same color, but I meant to make the last one different since it's a different category. So I just went over that with a darker marker and everything was completely fine, and just added some very quick headers, and that is pretty much it. Very simple layout. If you want, you can add some more washi tape to dress it up like I did, but I think it looks great even just like this. It's very simple and sticks to this autumn color palette. and it leaves plenty of space for you to do your planning for the week. Now for my last layout, I am going for a new layout that I have never done before, but I thought it would be perfect for this theme. So I'm starting off by tracing off a diagonal line and then separating this into 8 columns. And I'll outline this now so that you can see it a little better, since I know the pencil is hard to see. It's basically a very simple 7 or 8 column grid. But instead this is going to be on a diagonal, and this will go perfectly with the geometric pattern that we've been doing with everything. I decided to take it a step farther and to fill in all of the extra areas again with more of this plaid pattern. So I pulled in another color palette in these markers, and I'm going to be filling in this area. I actually am not sure if I like the way this came out. I think it's just a little too bold for me. So if you like a lot of color, then you might love this. But for me, it was a little bit much. So maybe next time I'll try this layout and just leave it a little more simple around the edges. I think it's really fun even just playing around with making a layout on an angle like this. And I think that already adds a lot of interest to the page. But anyway, I'm just going to finish doing this really quickly so you can see what it looks like at the end, and then I'll finish off the rest of the page. Alright, now that I finished off with all of the marker coloring that I'm going to be doing, I brought out my white gel pen, and some of my edges were a little messy, so I'm just going to be going over them with my white gel pen to clean them up. This is a very simple and quick tip to sort of fix any mistakes, or again, like I'm doing, just clean something up. It's a very simple step to take, but it makes a lot of difference sometimes. I'm going to use that same white gel pen to just add in my headers at the top, and then add in the dates in my columns, and that finishes this layout. I've got a couple more monthly spreads that I wanted to include for November. The first one is going to be just a page for me to write down a couple of different categories. So I'm going to have a section for my goals, one for projects, and one for events as well, because November is the start of the holiday season and there's going to be Thanksgiving going on, so I just wanted to make sure there's a place to put down any parties or traveling. And then on the other side, I'm making a gratitude log because, of course, it's Thanksgiving. Just wanted to get into this mindset of being grateful. I'm just going to fill these in really simply and quickly. It doesn't have to be anything too involved, but I really like how they came out. Sometimes simple is best. So that finishes off the setup for November. I hope you guys enjoyed this and that it gave you some new ideas for your journal. Let me know which of these spreads was your favorite or what you're doing in your journal this month. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you have a really great month and Thanksgiving, and I'll see you guys again next time. Bye!